and really appreciate them being willing to do this program this morning. Sarah and Scott met at Samford University, singing together, of course, and they've been doing it ever since then, in operas, operettas, etc. And Sarah has since, as she puts it, left the stage and is now heavily involved in textural art, in quilting and other forms of texture art. And she's actually an Alabama Humanities Foundation scholar and has been assisting with a book soon to come out on Alabama quilts. So we'll all look forward to that. Scott practiced law for some time and then decided that music was his calling and left the practice of law. And he's currently the director and let's see, how does he put it? The general and artistic director of Mobile Opera. And as so many creative people are doing now, has developed a program even during our distance apart from each other so that Mobile Opera will continue even during this COVID period. He's conductor in residence for the University of Mobile, and he and Sarah have had a really unpleasant gig in the past, as he has been the general director for an international performing arts program where they have had in the past to spend July in the Bavarian Alps of Germany. And that's so sad to hear. So, but we're so glad to have them with us today. They're going to take the poetic pairing from Ecclesiastes, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, lessons in letting go and remembering. Thank you, Sarah and Scott.
Thank you, Judy. When my daughter, our daughter, was about 9 years old, I guess, she came home from school one day and she said, "Daddy, I've got a project to make. I've got to make a musical instrument." So I said, "Well, good. Go and look in the pantry and see if there's a box of Quaker Oats. You know, we'll make a drum, or maybe we can get some balloons and, you know, and paper mache and make a pair of maracas or something like that." And she said, "Well, I had to sign up for something, so I've already got an assignment." And I said, "Okay, what is it?" She said, "We need to make a cello." And I kind of felt the same way when I realized that I had chosen a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. So it's a little hard to figure out. And then it was worse when I saw that the overarching theme of this was faith and the arts. And then also there was a pandemic, and so we're not able to do what we normally do and just sing. I mean, here we are in two parts of the house, and Randy's over there and wherever he is, and his piano is I don't know where either. So it just kind of comes down to us looking at each other for an hour, or finding something to talk about. I went to my first opera when I was 9 years old, and I loved it. I had no idea what was going on. I couldn't understand it. I was sitting way up in the balcony. I had gone because the director of music at my church was in it, and I thought he was the lead. It was Umbala, the masked ball, and I thought he had the lead. And you know, his part had been done and over with from practically scene one, but I watched the whole thing because I thought I was watching him, and I just fell in love with it. And I conducted some of the world's great symphonies in my parents' living room, and that's what I wanted to do. I realized at some point after going to school at Samford University, where, as Judy said, I met Sarah in the prestigious A Cappella Choir. That wasn't a good way to make a living. So or at least it might have been a good way, but it wasn't an easy way. So I went to law school, and I became a musician who practiced law for a living. Never stopped dealing with the music, never left the art, just simply practiced law as a means to make a living. in that process, while still doing mostly medical malpractice defense, Sarah and I managed to sing in about 60 something operas, and I don't know how many musical theater and oratorios and, you know, everything else. And then I wound up in 2010 as the General Director of Mobile Opera and conducting at the University of Mobile. So it just, I'm doing what I want to do. It just took me, you know, 40 years to get a job. And I thought that in the context of this, music reaches everyone. I mean, it is truly the universal language. It touches everyone, even babies that know nothing. People say, well, I don't know anything about classical music. You don't need to. You don't have to. You just know what you feel. And music connects us in a way that nothing else does. And I think that actually the arts, all the arts, in my case, it's music. I think that's one of the ways in which we're made in the image of God, because we are able to create. We've been given that ability to create something. And it's strange that you can stand on a stage and you can spin vibrations into the air that last for mere seconds and then are gone forever. And yet they do something for you internally. They do something that feeds your soul, that makes you feel connected to something greater, and it creates beauty. I had an uncle who was afflicted with polio when he was a little boy. And they said he'd never walk, but he was determined that he would prove them wrong, and he did. But he walked very poorly. He had tremendous upper body strength, but he had these little spindly legs, and he just kind of tottered around. And he bought a place up near Aniana, Alabama, that was up in the Black Warrior Basin. It had all this craggy area where there was this gorge that had been carved by this rushing stream. It had giant boulders, and it had an island out in the middle of it. This like 100-foot deep gorge with this pool at the bottom. It was just a wild place, and it was absolutely the wrong place for a man who had trouble walking to consider. But he bought it, and we spent so many weekends and most of our summers up there prying rocks out of that stratified cliff, literally breaking them with a sledgehammer and carrying them to Ed, my uncle, who would sit on the ground with a basin and an 80-pound bag of cement, and he would mix up enough mortar to take those rocks and fit them together. So we literally gathered stones so that Ed Welch could put them together to build pathways and to build steps, walls. He made that place into an absolute paradise. It was a fantasy land that we all enjoyed because it was so beautiful and he could get around in it. So I'm not sure what the writer of Ecclesiastes meant when he talked about gathering stones, but to me, whether the stones are artistic endeavors, whether the stones are literally stones, as in Ed Welch's case, we gather those things so that we put them together to make pathways to things of beauty. And in that way, we can create and we can be in the image of God. Sarah?
Well, I, like Scott, had struggled with how in the world we couldn't rely upon gathering stones and singing Rock of Ages and On Christ the Solid Rock I Stand. I mean, you know, that's a great musical program. But I thought, okay, what can I do that does not fall back upon music? Well, as Judy said, I got off the stage and decided, you know, it was good timing. But I also discovered that everybody has a need to create. I needed a creative outlet. If it were not going to be in music, then it needed to be something else. So I decided, okay, I can take up handiwork with my hands. It doesn't need an accompanist, and it doesn't need an audience in order to be fulfilling. So let's think a minute about letting go of things and also remembering. You know, at some point in our lives, we're all faced with letting go of stuff. It can be our stuff, it can be our great aunt's stuff, it can be our parents' stuff. The reasons are familiar to all of us. The first one that we encounter is moving. When Scott and I were getting ready to move to Mobile, you know, there's nothing as humbling as trying to pack up your entire household worth of stuff. So we had only been married 2 years, and I thought, we don't really have all that much stuff. So we went and got a U-Haul truck, medium size, and we put our stuff in it. There was a little bit left over. So we went down and got a U-Haul trailer to pull behind the U-Haul truck, and we put the rest of the stuff in it, and it completely filled the truck and the trailer, not 1 square inch of space left. And I came out of the house holding some curtain rods. The curtain rods did not make it to Mobile, needless to say. You know, we are faced always with the bittersweet task of dispensing with somebody else's stuff that belonged to our parents or our grandparents or our maiden aunt. And it's not all that hard to let go of pots and pans or that tacky Christmas sweater, or even, and this is a true story in my case, in my grandfather's attic, there was a box carefully wrapped and labeled "pieces of string too short to use." Why I didn't keep that, I don't know, because it was a treasure. But we got rid of the box, "pieces of string too short to use." You know, it's the things that evoke memories that we cling to. Maybe we fear that getting rid of the annoying cuckoo clock means we're getting rid of the memories that it evokes. But we can't keep all that stuff. There are jokes about how you can't take it with you. You all know the joke about how you've never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul. Well, you have to let it go. A couple of years ago, there was a young Japanese woman called Marie Kondo who came up with a method for tidying up your life. It was all the rage. Her method was called KonMari, and it really became a buzzword, as did the phrase, "Does it spark joy?" If you used her KonMari method, let's say to clean up your closet, you would take every article of clothing in your closet, you would hold it, and you would ask yourself, does it spark joy? You would also ask yourself, have I worn this in the last 3 years? If it did not spark joy, if you had not worn it, then you thanked it for its journey with you, and you let it go to someone else to continue its journey. And I laughed out loud when our daughter Alice told me about this. I thought, this is just ridiculous. And then I thought about it. You know, Marie Kondo was onto something. When you KonMari in your life, you let go of the extra stuff, the stuff that it has no meaning to you, that dilutes the things that are meaningful, and you let that go. And in her method, you're letting go of whatever clutters your life. You are respecting things that have served a purpose for you. You are thankful for the memories that you made with this thing, and you are embracing something only if it sparks joy. Well, after my dad died and I was dispensing with stuff, I found myself clinging to a whole stack of his silk neckties. Now, most of them had been given to him by his children and grandchildren because he was colorblind and he had absolutely no sense of fashion. And I just couldn't get rid of a bunch of those ties because they had memories attached to them. They sat in a paper bag for a long time. And then one day I thought, I know exactly what I'm going to do that will allow me to let go and remember. My grandmother, my dad's mother, had amazing needle skills, and she made several crazy quilts in her lifetime. Now, crazy quilts are a Victorian fancy quilt in which you take little tiny bits and pieces of fancy fabrics, satins, velvets, silks, and you use every piece of that gorgeous fabric in it. And there's no pattern for it. There are no rules for it. I thought, this is for me, no rules. And then I remembered also Ecclesiastes 3:7, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together. I think you'll hear more about this in Buzz's children's sermon today. Well, I followed that Bible verse and I tore apart my dad's ties. I sewed them back together into something totally unique and different. It was the very act of deconstructing those ties, cutting them into pieces. It was cathartic. I let go of the neckties, and the act of taking the little pieces of memories, and sewing them back together and making something beautiful created a way for me to remember the past without clinging to it. And I thought Marie Kondo was brilliant. Let go of what clutters your life, respect things that do have purpose, be thankful for memories, and embrace the things that spark joy. And so I will have to say, for me, this crazy quilt right here is the best example I know that I can give you of letting go and remembering. Scott?
The drapery rods did not get thanked. They are probably still in the woods in front of that house in Talladega. But I think Sarah has a point when you start to talk about when I started thinking about gathering stones and casting away stones. You know, if you gather, you have to cast away. And so I looked, of course, did a little research, and I found that the word monument and memorial seem to occur together so many times in the Bible. Memorial occurs 32 times in 31 verses. 29 of those are in the Old Testament. Each time the memorial or monument is built as something to recall some aspect of man's relationship to God. Well, you know, you think about our monuments, and of course we seem to be having a discussion about those monuments right now, and we think of tombstones, and we think of all of those memorials and monuments that dot battlefields all across the country, and there are many others. We can argue about which ones are important and which ones are not, which ones are right in their representation, which ones are wrong. But I think that maybe there are some of them that should go. There's probably some stones that maybe don't serve the purpose that they did once, or that purpose has been usurped, and maybe we ought to be letting go of them. When Joshua crossed the river of Jordan with the children of Israel, they took 12 stones, one for each tribe, and as the ark crossed over, as you know, halfway over, the waters receded. They crossed over in dry land as they did the Red Sea, and they took those 12 stones and they made a cairn. They made a monument, and that monument, the writer says, is there to this day. I don't know how you would know that. You know, if it's at the bottom of the Jordan River, maybe it is. But in a way, it is still there because of what it commemorates. And this is a gathering and a letting go at the same time. Let me illustrate with a story about my grandmother. My grandmother, Sarah Wright, she was a pretty amazing woman. She grew up and lived most of her life in Decatur, Tennessee, as she would say. And she lived in part of 3 centuries and 2 millennia. She was 105 years old when she died. True country woman, true pioneer woman, full of wisdom. When I was about 5 years old, we had moved to Birmingham from Tennessee and had rented a place that was near the airport. It was kind of funny. We had this pasture land around our little stucco house, and we rented from the German couple that lived up on the hill. And if you went down a little further, you came to Little Italy. So we had an international little community right there in Birmingham by the Birmingham airport. But there was a pasture that had it was unused, but it had a little knoll in the middle of it. You couldn't really call it a hill, just a slight incline. And I wanted to learn how to ride a bicycle. My brother had a bicycle named Rex. And I decided that I would borrow his bicycle and I would ask my grandmother to help me learn that, near occult sort of mystery of balancing on 2 wheels. She goes out with me and we push it up the hill or the knoll to get on top of the rise. And then she would hold both hands to the back of the seat while I pedaled, and we would go down the hill, me riding the bicycle, my grandmother running beside the back wheel. And we did that about 423 times, I think. Many bone-jarring sort of crashes that occurred, and I believe they were grandmother's fault. But then there was that one time that I started down the hill, and I, for some reason, glanced over my shoulder to say something to grandmother, and she was not there. Of course, she's back on the hilltop, and she's smiling because I'm learning to ride a bicycle. So in that instance, my grandmother had to let go. Now, if there were to be a memorial placed on that hill, it would not be to the fact that we were on the hill. It would not be that we had gathered there. It would be that she had let go of me. And my trust in that gave me the confidence then to learn how to ride a bicycle. The stones in Joshua's case are the same way. It is a memorial to the crossing of the River Jordan. It's also a letting go of the familiar, the things that they knew, the places that they had already established, of their comfort level. And they took their trust and this new confidence, and they went on. I think that we are in the same, if I can jump back to one quick personal story again. In 2005, I was in LaGrange, Georgia. I was the music director for LaGrange Lyric Theater, and I was preparing to conduct a show there. And I had time to think. Judy, this is before we traded LaGrange, Georgia in July for Bavaria in July. And I had time to think about it, pray about it, talk to Sarah about it on the phone anyway. And I decided that I was in the middle of a big practice. I was doing medical malpractice and kind of a blue ribbon sort of litigation. And I called my biggest client and I said, I decided that I want to retire. I want to quit. and I will work out what I have, which took me 5 years, by the way. But I will work out what I have, but I don't want any more assignments. And the risk manager, she said, funny you should call. I was going to call you because I decided that I'm going to retire the end of August next month. It was meant to be. And I know it sounds like just a speaker's artifice to tie those two together, but I really did think about my grandmother letting go of my bicycle, because my grandmother and Joshua, that gives me courage to do something that I want to be something that I want to be, to make a change, to leave behind the comfort, to cast away those stones that memorialize the things that have brought us to this point, and to let us go forward into something that that can be a world of beauty, a world of creation, and a new understanding of what our lives are meant to be. So I think that when you come to your own Rubicon, and if you're Caesar, or to your River Jordan if you're Joshua, or to the hill where you're going to learn to ride Rex, then you have to, at some point, build those memorials to remind you where you have come from. And you have to let them go, as God lets go of the seat of your bicycle, so that you can go forward to conquer the promised land. Sarah?
When I think about casting away stones and gathering stones together, I always have a very strong visual of stones gathered together to mark early graves. Think about Western movies. Along the trail in every Western movie, somebody dies, and they all gather stones together and pile them up on top of the grave to make a marker. Well, fortunately, and particularly for people who are interested in tracing their family trees, most markers, most tombstones actually do have dates and names on them that are etched in time. I was never particularly interested in tracing my family tree or researching or doing genealogy. To me, it was just a bunch of dead relatives. I never met them. I was not curious about them. But for my mother's 80th birthday some years ago, I decided to fill in some gaps on her family tree. Her people had moved to Mississippi in the early 1830s, right after the last treaty was signed with the Chickasaw Indians, ceding the rest of their lands to the United States government. We all know the Trail of Tears. We also know that there were some Native Americans who stayed on the lands, and some even married into the white settlers' families. And my mother had this piece of paper. Oh, I don't know what I did with it. Well, it was a piece of paper that her whole life, she had this piece of paper that her mother had written, and it said, I am the daughter of Sebring Bilbo, the son of Joseph Bilbo, who was the son of Charlotte Ryan, who was the daughter of Isaac Ryan. And Isaac Ryan was the son of Jerome Ryan, and Jerome Ryan was the son of Apaha, a great Choctaw Indian chief. Now, my grandmother, with her porcelain skin and green eyes and bright red hair, took this claim seriously. my mother found it quite amusing, but as did the rest of us. But after my grandmother died, I decided that, for my mother's birthday, I would fill in some of these gaps on the tree. There were some gaps, and I thought I can do that for her as a surprise birthday present. I would settle the question once and for all: was my mother, or was she not, descended from a great Indian chief? Well, this was before the days of 23andMe or DNA testing or all that stuff that we do now. But it was not before the days when you could do digital archival research while still wearing your pajamas and drinking your morning coffee. So I started to dig deeper than just names and dates on tombstones. And, I sort of got into it. All of those dead ancestors started to become real people to me. I was able to find land grants that showed where they lived, what land they bought. With city directories, I could find out what businesses they ran and what their addresses were. Census records, of course, showed me who lived in the same household and who their neighbors were. And thank goodness for church records that celebrated marriages, cemetery records that showed children that had died from yellow fever. I found that I am indeed descended from Presbyterians and Methodists and Quakers and Catholics. And I don't need DNA testing to find out that all of my ancestors are European. They came from England and Scotland and Ireland and France. So even though I don't have any of their stuff, their worldly goods, I do now have facts that help me understand these people. What motivated them? What challenged them? I can walk around in their shoes, in their world. But by gathering these bits of and pieces of facts about them, I could piece it all together like a crazy quilt into a story of their lives. Now, it took me a while, but I climbed all the way to the top of my mother's family tree. I was looking, remember, for the great Indian chief Apaha. And when we had the big reveal at her 80th birthday party, I was able to confirm we do indeed have a Native American ancestor. Unfortunately, you have to be a flying squirrel in order to get to her, because you go way up the tree to the tallest limb and you go out it, and then you have to make a flying leap over to some other little limb and go way out it and across it and come down in order to find her. But she is there. She is the daughter of an Indian chief and on a distant branch from which my grandmother and my mother did not descend. I went on this genealogical expedition journey in order to find a monument, a great monument to an Indian chief. But what I found along the way was, if you let go of the big monument and you gather little stones that matter along the way, and you cast away the stones that are meaningless, then you will be rewarded. You let go of what does not matter, and you remember what does. Letting go and remembering. For me, it's good advice for life. Buzz?
Well, thank y'all so much for sharing. These are wonderful reflections and a good reminder to folks that, of course, while we have very gifted people in certain gifts, of course, we all know of Scott and Sarah as such great musicians. And as Sarah said, that, that the hymns that would have flown out of this theme would have almost created the program themselves. It's also a great reminder that we all have many gifts. And so it's great to hear reflections in story and in visual art and in writing, that we don't typecast ourselves or typecast one another to think any of us can only do one thing. As Sarah was talking about the crazy quilt and the broken curtain rod, it reminded me, if you saw, I got up and ran into the other room and came back. One of my stoles, the red stole that I wear on each year on Pentecost and on the Sunday that we ordain elders and deacons, and occasionally if there's an ordination or installation of a friend of mine as a pastor somewhere else. This stole is one in a small collection. When I was in seminary, one of my good friends, as we were all graduating, and she made these stoles out of her grandmother's red curtains, and made, I think, 7 or 8 of them, and gave one to each person in our friend group. And so that repurposing and the creativity of turning one thing into another, the sort of the liturgical equivalent of a crazy quilt, is now spread around at least the Southeast, if not around the country, when all of us on Pentecost, for sure, wear this same red stole, and maybe we're woven together from afar as well. So that just reminded me of that visual. And Scott, thank you. That image of letting go on the bike, I think that's perfect. I really, really love that. We've had some folks who have chimed in. Let's see, Stephanie and Patrick Jacobs say.
I'd like to say, Buzz, that
yeah.
You may ask any question that you like of us, and we will answer any question that we like.
Great. Thanks for the wide open possibility. So Rand, let's see, we've got a lot of folks commenting in here. Stephanie and Patrick Jacobs said, such wonderful stories and insights. Thank you so much for sharing with us this morning. Randy said, this was absolutely beautiful and moving. Susan Abrams, you're both wonderful storytellers. I've learned, remembered, and been inspired. Susan Tomlinson said, I can say y'all were talking to me. I think a lot of us, Sarah, as you were talking about the Marie Kondo stuff, started thinking a little bit more about what all do I have in that drawer or on that shelf in the closet or maybe sitting right in the living room. And Judy thanks you as well for sharing such meaningful stories from your life. So we've got a lot of gratitude being shared, but not a lot of questions right now, which is okay. Let me remind folks, though, if you'd like to ask a question or share a comment, you can also unmute yourselves and ask your question out loud.
Well, Lawrence Huey just asked, when were we at Samford? We graduated in '74.
I'm guessing he's got some connections there as to what leads to the question. So Scott, when you talked about not only the sort of mid-career change from practicing law to becoming the director of operas, but even at the beginning, as you said, I'm a musician who you found yourself as a musician who practiced law. I've done some work around the idea of vocation and the way that we talk about vocation and in the church, and one of the problems is that when we talk about who's called, often we only talk about ministers or church professionals as being called, when in reality all of us are called and given all these gifts. But there's some more recent theologians who've said, as we wrestle with this idea of our own vocation, not just our where our paycheck comes from, but our sense of calling. Who are we made to be? What are the gifts God has given us, and how do we find as many opportunities as possible to use those gifts? A recent theologian who's lifted up, in particular, artists and musicians and actors as some of the role models for how the rest of us can talk about our sense of vocation and calling. Sometimes freeing ourselves from this need to identify our vocation, that is what God calls us to do, with our paycheck or our professional life. That sometimes those are the same, but they're not always. And that many actors and musicians and artists can talk about the difference between a day job and the work that fills your life, right? Is it working to live or living to work? That balance. And so I think that's a great thing for all of us, regardless of our age and stage in life, to reflect on what some of God's gifts are in us and how those can be used. Not just does it put food on the table. Food on the table matters, certainly, but using your gifts in other ways as well is really important. So
this is one of the things we talk about in the arts, that we have to look at profession a little bit differently than we might have in the past, because for the opera singer, for example, the gig singer who just goes from place to place singing, it's almost impossible to make that into a profession now, as far as if you define profession as the way you make a living. Very few people have that luxury of being able to only perform their art. So we find that they're doing all sorts of other things, and you find professional singers like, well, Patrick there, who's teaching, but he's also a singer. That doesn't lessen the fact that he's a professional musician. Randy Sheets, you say that, well, he's not out performing concerts, in concert halls. That's irrelevant to the idea of being a musician or being an artist. And I think that we've done a really poor job of succumbing to labeling people. So we say, you're a lawyer. We know you, we know what you do, we know how you feel, we know everything about you because we know that. Well, most of the people that I performed with from an artistic standpoint didn't know I was a lawyer. They're always surprised. I mean, years later, they're surprised to find you practice law, because they're not seeing me in that context. It is a problem, I think, whether you're talking about a profession or anything else, of labeling people and assuming that you know them and you know a lot about them because of the label that you choose to place on them. And that's always the dangerous sort of thing. It leads to, in many cases, to a disrespect.
Thoughts or questions in the chat box? Lawrence is making all sorts of connections to growing up in Birmingham. If he stays at it, Sarah, you might have to add a limb to the family tree. Lawrence might determine y'all are cousins before this is over. So, other thoughts or questions or connections? I know before Scott and Sarah got on, Judy and I were talking with Wanda about the quilting and other connections that we've got a quilting group in our church as well. So if anything that Sarah said today sparked some interest, one of the things that has occurred, of course, massive transitions over the course of time, and way too much to go into it, but just briefly to note that we went from a point in history throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance where, largely speaking, the church was one of, if not the major sort of patron of the arts that produced much visual and musical art for worship and for the sake of the church. And now we see a different transition, certainly, in that. But one of the things that excites me, and I think it's not absolutely unique, but there's a special feeling about it here at Spring Hill Pres, is not this sense of patron of the arts. We don't go out and spend tons and tons of money to commission all these pieces. Occasionally we do something special, like for our 75th anniversary, that wonderful hymn and new tune that was put to it. But I think of it more as the church. A church like Spring Hill is a place that can, within the context of faith and worship, also be a place that celebrates the arts, that both enables others to see and hear what our members can do, but also to make a home for artists. We've got the Artist in Residence program that with Melissa Root and the painting. All of this is pre-coronavirus, of course, but the Painting Pals, the group that meets on Tuesdays to paint and hopefully to welcome folks trying it for the first time. quilting group. Obviously, of course, our wonderful choirs and music, but we've got the religious arts committee that schedules these sorts of things, field trips to go see glass blowing, or conversations after, wonderful performances. We have this summer series, but we also, we're the host site for the Mobile Art Association that meets once a month in our Bullard, or our Eddington building. Just these many ways that we can become a place that welcomes people to explore what creative gifts they may have in their own life. Let's see, other thoughts or questions? Stephanie and Patrick said they'd like to see some of the quilts you've made. That doesn't mean you have to go run to the other room.
Make that happen
Right now, but yeah, I think I'm sure we could make that happen. And Hilda Gewen laughed out loud at the grandmother story, so that's great. So there's all sorts of good comments coming in. Any questions folks would like to ask for Scott and Sarah while we still have some time? You answered everything. What you covered it all. Great job, everybody. Great job, Scott and Sarah. As I was listing out all of those ways that I think our church is a celebrator of the arts and an inviter of the arts. Also, y'all remember, again, when we're back together in person, when we can be physically in the same space, that our library is also a place that we have been running a rotating art exhibit where we're showcasing the art of many of our members. So that's a wonderful piece as well. Well, as we wrap up and prepare to transition into a time of worship, Judy, you want to tell us about what's coming up next week? Oh, you're on mute, Judy. Sorry.